Today's story is about a slaying that took place in 1921 in Mangamahu, New Zealand. A slaying that is so bizarre and brutal, it's almost incomprehensible. How did a night of drinking turn into something so horrific? We all heard the saying, be careful what you wish for. And that's true, but you should also be careful of the wishes you grant. And that saying may be more suitable for this story. Hello strangers and strangelings. Welcome back to the Strange Bar and Grill. Today I'm serving up another true crime story time. And right now, I'm just sipping on some coffee because it's 5 a.m. and I apparently needed a caffeine punch to the face. Today's story is a bizarre one and I'm not gonna hold you any longer, so let's go. George Gordon and Merv Addenbrook shared a modest ware. A ware is a Maori hut or house. In this instance, it was a small dwelling that sat about 500 yards from the main homestead, conveniently close to the road. The ware was divided into two rooms. George occupied the much larger room with the fireplace at one end, while Merv made his bed in the smaller room at the back. It was a simple arrangement, but it suited them well enough. George had a habit of going on drinking bouts every 6 weeks or so, sometimes stretching to 2 months. When the mood struck him, he would gather his drinking companions and they would hole up in the ware, ordering more and more grog from the Mangamahu hotel as the days wore on. This particular bout had been going on for nearly a fortnight, so that's 2 weeks, and Merv found himself getting very little sleep night after night. All the laughter and drunken singing was just keeping him awake until the middle of the night. One evening, his patience wore thin. Merv decided to confront Jack Kinsella, George's chief drinking mate, about his incessant playing of his accordion. Merv told him plainly that he was keeping him from his much-needed rest. But Kinsella, a brute of a man with a quick temper, did not take kindly to his complaint. He offered to bash his brains out for his troubles, and Merv quickly realized the precariousness of his position. Seething with resentment, but also valuing his skull intact, Merv backed down and resigned himself to another sleepless night. That was probably a good idea, Merv. You don't want to not have a brain. The next morning, as Merv prepared to leave for work, Merv found George in a rare moment of sobriety. He was sharpening his axe with a file. The sight unnerved him. Merv had a sinking feeling that something drastic might happen later, judging by the dark undercurrents Merv sensed in the ware. Merv confided his fears to his cousin Cecil, but there was little to be done. Merv also noticed with alarm that his long-bladed pig-sticking knife, which Merv kept in his cupboard, had gone missing. Merv later learned that Kinsella had taken it and used it to threaten George, even going so far as to drawing the blade across George's throat in a macabre jest. George, far from being frightened, merely said, "You made a bloody bad job of that, Jack." The day wore on, and Merv went about his work with a sense of foreboding. When Merv returned to the ware around 5:30 in the evening, Merv first went to fetch the cows. On his return, Cecil, sensing his exhaustion, kindly offered to let him bring his bedclothes down to the main house so that Merv could get some proper sleep away from the ongoing drinking party. Merv headed into the ware to clean up and change for the evening meal at Cecil's. As Merv walked through the open door into the dark room, he felt his feet slipping in something sticky on the floor. Puzzled and alarmed, Merv struck a match to see what it was, and the sight that greeted him was one of unimaginable horror. There was George, his head nearly severed from his body, hanging on by a thin strip of skin. He was a large, heavy-set man, and the amount of blood that had poured from his wounds covered half the floor in a dark, glistening pool. As Merv stood there, frozen in shock, he noticed Kinsella and another man nearby on a bench, both heavily intoxicated. Kinsella was mumbling to his companion, claiming responsibility for the gruesome deed. Kinsella would say, "He asked me to cut off his head," Kinsella slurred. "He laid on the floor and asked me to cut off his head, and I did it." Sickened and terrified, Merv fled to the ware and ran to find Cecil. He burst into the house, his voice shaking as he told him there had been a murder and that George had been decapitated. Cecil, fearing for the safety of his own family, asked him to fetch Jim Campbell, a neighbor, for help. Merv raced to Jim's house and found him eating his dinner, Despite the urgency of the situation, Jim insisted on finishing his meal at a casual pace while Merv fidgeted impatiently, shuffling from foot to foot. Could you imagine finding your roommate decapitated and you run and go get help from the neighbor and he's just eating his dinner or just nonchalantly, just casually just eating at a slow pace? That would make me go insane. When Jim finally finished, they hurried back to intercept Kinsella and the other man who were making their way to the main house, claiming they wanted Cecil to call the police. They managed to coax them up onto the road, with Jim keeping a watchful eye on Kinsella, while Merv monitored the other man. Kinsella seemed to be sobering up and made an excuse about wanting to cover up the horses, but they suspected he might be planning to jump into the nearby Mangamahu River from the high cliff beside the weir. They kept them on the road for about an hour until more neighbors arrived to lend a hand, and as rain began to fall, they herded everyone into the wool shed near the road. To keep Kinsella calm and compliant, he was given the occasional splash of whiskey as he awaited for the arrival of the police. It was a long, tense wait, nearly 3 hours before the police car from Wanganui finally reached them. During that time, Kinsella grew increasingly restless, groping around the wool press in a way that made them fear he might make a break for it, using the iron bell clips as weapons. So another generous measure of whiskey was administered to subdue him. When the police car's lights appeared in the distance, someone called out, "Here come the police!" And at that, Kinsella made a desperate bid for freedom, leaping from the high doorstep of the wool shed. But one of the neighbors managed to grab his foot, tripping him, and they all piled on to restrain him before he could get away. The police took him into custody, leaving one officer behind to clean up the grisly scene and transport the body to Wanganui the following day. The next morning, Constable McMullen and Merv went up to the weir to deal with the aftermath of the murder. In the chill of the frosty morning air, they cleaned up the blood and wrapped George's body in his own blankets. The blankets were not quite long enough to cover him completely, leaving one pale foot exposed. McMullen, in a gesture that was as practical as it was macabre, used a length of baling twine to sew George's head back onto his neck, ensuring it would remain in place during transport. They then loaded the body into the back seat of George's cousin's yellow Maxwell 5-seater car, 3 of them squeezing into the front for the 6-mile journey to Mangamahu. When they arrived at the Mangamahu Hotel, Constable McMullen hauled the corpse out of the car and hoisted it onto his shoulder. He carried it over to the pub and propped it up against the wall near the bar entrance, while he went inside for a few stiff drinks to steady their nerves. And as they were inside, some children coming home for lunch noticed the odd-looking bundle and began to examine it curiously. The constable, spotting them, would shoo them away, telling them that they best run along home. News of the murder had spread quickly through the grapevine, and the children, suddenly realizing what the package might contain, fled in terror. At last, the Royal Mail arrived, a large Hudson bus that would carry the body the rest of the way to Wanganui. The driver came in for a meal before setting off on the return journey. George's body was placed in the very back compartment of the bus, with no passengers other than the constable boarding at Mangamahu. Halfway to Fordale, the bus stopped at Kawangaroa to pick up some passengers. One man carrying a large bag asked the constable where he should put his bag, and the constable took the bag and placed it just inside the rear door next to George's body. When they arrived at Fordale, most of the passengers disembarked to have a drink at the hotel. The man would ask the constable to retrieve his bag, and the constable told him it was just inside the back door. The man opened the door and gripped the bag by the handle, but as he did that, he caught sight of the dead man's protruding foot. Startled and horrified, he grabbed his bag and quickly ran away, making a beeline for the train that was about to depart for Wanganui. After that incident, Merv was told that the Maoris never again rode in that particular bus. The inquest drew large, curious crowds, and Merv, being only 20 years old and never having set foot in a courtroom before, found the experience nerve-wracking and embarrassing. Kinsella had engaged Humphrey O'Leary, a lawyer who would later become the Chief Justice of New Zealand and be knighted to represent him. As the chief witness, Merv was kept on the stand for what felt like hours, fielding questions from all sides, especially from O'Leary. Merv was asked about his premonition that something terrible might happen and how Kinsella had come to threaten George with his knife. Merv found these questions difficult to answer, but he did his best to stick to the truth as Merv knew it. George was a solitary man with no family in New Zealand, a true hermit. Merv had no doubt in his mind that he indeed asked Kinsella to end his life. Merv had experienced George's suicidal tendencies firsthand on several occasions, when he asked him to shoot him while Merv was cleaning his rifle after a pig hunt. These requests only came when he was deep in his cups of whiskey. Many times, Merv had to half carry, half drag George to his bed after he'd drunk himself into a stupor and fallen off his chair, lying helpless on the floor. In the end, Kinsella was sentenced to 14 years in prison, though Merv later heard that he was released after 8 for good behavior. The brand of whiskey George had been drinking at the time of his death was Sandy McDonald, and it was promptly pulled from the market following the trial. It would not be sold again in New Zealand for another 66 years, only reappearing on shelves in 1988. The murder of George Gordon and the events surrounding it left an indelible mark on Merv. It was a stark reminder of the dark depths to which man can sink when in the grip of alcohol and despair. Though justice was served, the memory of that bloody night in the Weir and the sight of George's nearly severed head would haunt Merv for years to come. It was a hard lesson in the fragility of life and the dangerous passions that can drive men to commit the most heinous of acts.